We often tell you on the show about the revolving door between government and private sector. They go to the private sector, they make a lot of money, they go to the government, and they look out for the private sector. And then they get out of the government, they go back to the private sector, and they make a ton of money. And then they go back into the government. You get the sense. And we've shown you how many cases here on the Young Turks. Mary Shapiro only being the latest, she's now appointed to the SEC. Before, she was protecting the bankers as one of their top lawyers, making millions of dollars. Before that, she was at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the government, prosecuting bankers. And before that, she was in private industry, defending bankers. That's how this game is played. Now, so the government organization she's going to run is the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. Well, the Project on Government Oversight did an interesting report on the revolving door at the SEC. Do you know that just in the first 2 years of them leaving the agency, because that's all they have to report, between the years of 2001 and 2010, 419 former SEC employees filed at least 1,949 disclosure statements revealing that they planned to represent a private sector client with SEC business. So, what does that mean? That means there was almost 500 guys who used to work at that government body regulating the banks, who then came out and in just the first 2 years of them being out, petitioned nearly 2,000 times to take it easy on the banks. Man, SEC, you don't want to regulate them. Hey, you remember me? I'm Bob from down the office, right? I mean, I was just down the hall from you, just 2 offices down. Remember how we used to go to lunch all the time? Come on, we're buddies. Don't regulate my banks. And by the way, if you know what's good for you, we got a position for you here in a couple of years too. That's how this game is played. So let me show you all the wonderful goodies they got for their banks. So for example, there were 64 waivers that allowed companies to avoid new regulatory examinations. You don't need no stinking examinations, so you get those waivers. 35 of them were requested by former SEC employees that now work for the banks. They secured 40 waivers that allowed offending companies to continue selling small amounts of stock without registering it. Who needs to register stock when you got friends in high places? And 16 former SEC officials helped their new private sector employers continue to provide financial services that they would have been banned from supplying. Being banned, that's for guys who can't afford to bribe the guys that used to work at the SEC. No, you guys aren't banned. And of course, the number one waivers that went most often was to the top banks, and it was to allow them to do things that they weren't normally supposed to do. And Huffington Post has a terrific story on this, and that's where a lot of these facts are from. And I want to give you a quote that they had as well about just one company, JP Morgan. Quote, since 2003, the SEC had granted exemptions to JP Morgan and its subsidiaries when they were charged with alleged misconduct relating to mortgage securities products, transactions with Enron, initial product offerings, and research analyst conflicts of interest. So all those different problems, you're exempt from all of it. Come on, you're hired the guy from the SEC who's still friends with the other guy from the SEC who you're going to hire as soon as he leaves his job. This is sick, man. They're not doing any regulating over there. They're just figuring out how to rob us blind and get exemptions and waivers for it. I'm going to give you a long quote here from 3 SEC officials in February of 2011, according to the New York Times. Why? Because the New York Times investigated why they weren't actually regulating these guys, why they weren't fining them. I mean, look, we know that they're not even jailing them. Recently, we had the HSBC case where the government literally said, listen, if we put some of them in jail, it might endanger HSBC, which might endanger the entire banking community, which might endanger the global economy, so we can't do it. They're too big to jail. Apparently, they were also too big to fine. When they were asked about it, they said this. This is the government officials responding to the New York Times. An SEC action against an investment bank for the conduct of one of its divisions could have the perverse effect of prohibiting that firm from managing mutual funds in a different division or subsidiary. Once abandoned by their advisors, these orphaned funds could run the risk of serious losses, and customers could lose access to their money. It makes no sense for the Commission to impose an unnecessary and artificial delay on a firm's access to the capital markets for wholly unrelated conduct, especially if a delay would provide no benefit to investors and may harm the markets. How you like them apples? Translation, well, it's a big bank. If I find one part of the bank, well, then it could affect other parts of the bank, and it may harm the markets. And God knows we wouldn't want to harm the markets, the same markets that are going to hire us in a couple of months. This is their admission to the New York Times. This is the government saying basically, too big to fine. We can't do it. So they're free to go. Now, they've done fines in other instances when it was so egregious, they're like, well, we've got to do some sort of fine. And as we've told you, sometimes they funnel that money back, as they did in the fiscal cliff deal. They gave one particular corporation $500 million back of the fine that they had given them initially. Now, whenever it's so egregious, it's such a violation of the law that they should go to jail, they get a fine instead. Some of which gets taken from taxpayers and given to them, right? And when they can get away with not fining them at all, they say, well, we wouldn't want to harm the banks and we wouldn't want to harm the markets, so there won't even be fines. Instead, there'll be exemptions and they will be waivers. Mary Shapiro, to be fair to her, did once consider at least regulating the money market funds. Well, she dropped it when an SEC commissioner, who's normally tough on regulation, Luis Aguilar, said, no, I don't want to do that one. You don't want to regulate money market funds. Why did this so-called tough regulator not want to do that? Aguilar used to work for mutual funds. Huh. Weird how that works.